Chapter 4, the integumentary system. So the integumentary system, or the integument, is the skin and its derivatives, meaning the things that basically grow out or into the skin: hair, glands, and our nails, fingernails and toenails. So if we look at this figure here, 4.2, the integumentary system is what you see here, with the epithelial tissue, underlying connective tissue, and technically the subcutaneous layer, or the hypodermis, is not part of the integumentary system, but we will talk about it since it is attached to the skin. So it is a cutaneous membrane. It's a dry membrane that's exposed to the environment. And if you remember our discussion on membranes in the previous chapter, there's always an epithelium with an underlying connective tissue. So on our outer body, our skin is dry, so it's keratinized, stratified, squamous epithelium. Keratinized because there's a lot of the keratin protein in the cells of the epithelium, giving it strength and toughness, but also preventing water loss. Stratified because there's more than one cell layer thick. And then squamous because the apical top layer of cells are flattened. And then the underlying connective tissue, initially just deep to the epithelium, it is areolar connective tissue. And as we go a bit deeper, it's dense irregular connective tissue. Excuse me. So there are 4 tissue types in the epithelium. In the integumentary system, we have the epithelium, stratified squamous epithelium. There's underlying connective tissue, areolar and dense irregular connective tissue. There's also smooth muscle in the integumentary system. There are blood vessels in the underlying connective tissue, which is called the dermis. It's vascularized. If you remember the epithelium, or the epidermis, but the epithelial layer is avascular. And then there's, the smooth muscles are found in the blood vessels, allowing them to constrict and to dilate. So our blood vessels are lined with some smooth muscle, but also there is an erector pili muscle at each hair follicle, and that's that little sliver of muscle you see here that allows the hair follicle to be pulled upright or erect, hence the name erector pili muscle. And there's also nervous tissue. The smooth muscle is innervated. There are sensory and tactile innervation for touch, pressure, temperature, and pain. So the integumentary system has all 4 tissue types. So overall structure and function of the integument, your figure 4.1, you should know essentially everything on here. Overall functions: protection, it's a covering against the environment, helps prevent water loss, dehydration, and protection from pathogens. Regulation of temperature, when you sweat, that helps cool you off. Excretion and secretion. There are gland cells that secrete a watery material, sweat or sebum, the watery and oily material, and some metabolic waste. So there is some excretion via the skin or the integument. And then nutrition. Vitamin D is synthesized in the skin with the absorption of some ultraviolet light. And then helps provide sensation from the environment because it is innervated. So you can sense touch and pressure because our skin or our integument is innervated. And then again, controls permeability. It is a boundary layer. Your skin is dry unless you're sweating. And in that case, it helps prevent excess water loss. Overall structure. There's an overlying apical epidermis, which is stratified squamous epithelium. and that's called the epidermis. Underneath it is the dermis, and as you can see here, there are two layers. The accessory structures are the hair and the hair follicles, nails, fingernails, and toenails, and exocrine glands. If you remember exocrine versus endocrine glands, exocrine glands have ducts. So here's a sweat gland with a fairly long duct to the surface, and here's a sebaceous oil gland with a relatively short duct that empties into the hair follicle. And then the underlying subcutaneous layer, or hypodermis, and I believe in the last chapter we also mentioned that it is also referred to as the superficial fascia. Technically it's not part of the integument, but it is part of how the integument attaches to the underlying tissue, so it's always considered at least an accessory part of the integumentary system. So the epidermis, keratinized, which is a nice strong protein, stratified squamous epithelium. There are 5 layers in the epidermis in thick skin, and thick skin is found on the soles of your feet and in the palms of your hands. The deepest layer is the stratum basale, or also called the stratum germinativum. Basale because it's like the basal layer. It is one layer of cells thick. It is attached to the underlying connective tissue by the basement membrane, highlighted here, or magnified here. And there are basal stem cells there that divide via mitosis, and the stem cells, once they divide, produce keratinocytes, which are the cells that produce keratin, so the cells of our epidermis. There are also melanocytes that produce the pigment melanin that give us pigmentation in our skin. The number of melanocytes that humans have is fairly constant, fairly even amount or equal amount among different people on Earth. The difference in skin color is due to the amount of melanin that's produced. Where's my cursor? There we go. The difference in skin color is based on the amount of melanin that's produced and the type of melanin, because as we'll see, melanin comes in different shades. Okay, and then there are also Merkel cells, which are involved in sensation of touch. So all of these cells are found in the stratum basale. Here's another view from another source, another textbook. So this layer here is the stratum basale, one cell layer thick. There are melanocytes, Merkel cells, and then the other cells, all the other cells are the basal stem cells that when they divide, this one's undergoing mitosis, they replace themselves, and one of the other daughter cells gets pushed out and becomes a keratinocyte and enters into the next layer of the epidermis. The next layer is called the stratum spinosum. Here's a slide of the integument. So this is the surface, the apical surface exposed to the environment. And we go down and we go down, and there's a change in appearance. We go down deeper, and then there's that zigzaggy boundary, the basement membrane, and then beneath it, deep to it, is the underlying connective tissue. So the fairly even row of nuclei that you see here are the cells of the stratum basale. And again, those cells are stem cells. They are mitotically active. When they divide, they replace themselves, and one of the other cells gets pushed out into the next layer, the stratum spinosum. It is several cell layers thick, up to 10 cells thick, as you see here. All of this part is the stratum spinosum. There's some mitosis that occurs there, but most of the mitosis is in the stratum basale. There are also what are called Langerhans or dendritic cells that roam around in the stratum, and they serve immune function, looking for pathogens and will destroy them. And here's a Langerhans cell or a dendritic cell, and it just wanders around looking for potential pathogens like bacteria that might have entered via a scrape or a cut or a wound into the skin. Next out is the stratum granulosum here, and it usually has a somewhat darker appearance on a slide, and it's fairly thin, about 3 to 5 cells thick. Here the cells are starting to produce keratohyalin and keratin in abundance to prepare the cells to be fully keratinized as they migrate out towards the apical surface. Cell death begins here because what happens is, as these cells, once they're produced from the stratum basale stem cells, these cells just start to migrate out because they're pushed out as these cells continue mitosis. So a cell produced by a stem cell will be close to the basement membrane, but it will get slowly pushed out. Eventually it will become a cell of the stratum. Once it's in the stratum basale, as it moves out and out, it will become a cell in the stratum granulosum, and so forth, out and outwards. As those cells migrate away from the underlying connective tissue, they are moving further and further away from their source of nutrients. If you remember, epithelium is avascular, no blood vessels. The blood vessels are down in the connective tissue, so those blood vessels in the connective tissue provide the oxygen and nutrients via diffusion. So as the cells move further away, they start to starve, and they start to starve, and they start to die. Okay, moving out now to the stratum lucidum, which is shown here. Stratum lucidum, it's a fairly thin layer, and it's found only in the thick skin. It is absent in thin skin. Only about 3 to 5 cells thick. The cells start to flatten out, becoming squamous. Down here they are cuboidal. The amount of keratin accumulates more and more in the stratum lucidum. And then finally we get out to the stratum corneum, which is the thickest layer of the epidermis. Anywhere from 20 to 30 or more cell layers thick, depending on how thick the skin is. The keratinized cells are dead, and by the time they reach the apical surface, they will wear off, flake off, or be rubbed off due to abrasion in the environment. Okay, let's look at thick versus thin skin. So most of your body is covered by thin skin, which is fairly thin, only 0.8 millimeters, pretty thin. And that's where you have hair on your body, like on your arms, your torso, your head, etc. Only 4 layers. The layer that's missing in thin skin is the stratum lucidum. And there's hair growing on your thin skin, whether it's fine hair or thick, coarse hair, like on your head or mustache if you have a mustache. Thick skin is found on the palms and the soles of the feet, and it has all 5 layers. And no hair is growing on your palms or soles of your feet. Okay, let's talk about dermal ridges or fingerprints. These are epidermal ridges and the dermal papilla that are enlarged, and what a dermal papilla is these mounds, these up and down ridges that are formed by the underlying connective tissue, where they kind of they form a nice tight junction. Sorry, my cursor's asleep again. Nice tight junction with the overlying epidermis. And we'll continue this on the next lecture.